Throughout the world, throngs of people hailed the end of the war in Europe.
The pose may not be dignified, but the young lady is not the least upset. Peace, it's wonderful.
It is estimated that the total cost of bringing our forces back to these shores will be about $1,400 million.
The reconversion of war plants to peacetime pursuits is going ahead at full speed. And once more, the automobile factories are humming. Yes, soon you'll have that long-awaited refrigerator in the kitchen, along with a new stove. The assembly lines are rolling merrily.
In 1945, the Second World War ended in a sudden, devastating flash. Americans were no more prepared for peace in 45 than they had been for war in 41. Victory had been inevitable. Most Americans had come to believe that early on. But no one had expected the war to end so suddenly. Now peace had broken out. With it came a mass of new financial, political, and social problems, more than Americans were prepared to face. In Europe, the armies of the Western democracies, victorious in Italy and France, advanced to the Nazi Germany itself. The Red Army of the Soviet Union smashed into Germany from the east and hammered on the gates of Berlin. The two most powerful forces the world had ever seen met at the River Elbe, the United States and the Soviet Union. Allies, for one more day at least, they toasted their common victory and the total destruction of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich.
This is a solemn but glorious hour. I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day.
Throughout the world, throngs of people hailed the end of the war in Europe. It is 5 years and more since Hitler marched into Poland. Years full of suffering and death and sacrifice. Now the war against Germany is won. A grateful nation gives thanks for victory. Hundreds of thousands crowd into American churches to give thanks to God.
Heroic dead of a combined Army and Marine force mark the grim battlefield of Okinawa, where one of the bloodiest engagements of the war is being fought. Thousands of Yanks have been wounded, and other thousands have sacrificed their lives to drive a fanatical foe from this vital base, the doorstep to Japan itself.
Americans watched the newsreels from the Pacific with foreboding. How many more years of war would there be? The deeply entrenched Japanese seemed determined to hold out to the last man. What kind of fanatical resistance would there be? How many more dead and wounded when American forces finally landed on the home islands of Japan? The first atomic bomb was tested that July in New Mexico. Its power astounded even the scientists who created it. Just two, atomic bombs ended the war with Japan in a matter of days and forever changed the course of world history. No American tears were shed that day for the 95,000 Japanese who had died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Public opinion polls taken that August of 1945 showed that a full 85% of the American people approved of the use of the atomic bombs against the Japanese. Only later would these joyful Americans begin to comprehend the enormity of what had been created. Only gradually would they come to realize what heavy responsibilities attend the possession of such awesome power. Americans cheered and danced in the streets until dawn, no more prepared for peace than they had been for war.
And peace came to our overseas bases. Guam and Guadalcanal, Kwajalein, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and all the others. Some are being demilitarized already. Others will remain as permanent outposts of American defense, a continuing cost to the public, but a necessity to our military security. A mighty permanent Navy and a powerful standing Army will be another costly part of this military security. Americans know, too, that forces of occupation in the defeated countries are vital to the peace which was bought at so high a price by our men and our dollars. The feeding, housing, and clothing of these men will be an expensive responsibility for years to come. But the more immediate problem is to return millions of servicemen and women to their homes. The most extensive troop movements ever to be undertaken by any nation have been underway since VE Day and will continue well into 1946. This means American resourcefulness, transportation, and dollars. For it costs about $200 to bring a man back from Okinawa. About $100 will bring him back from Europe. It is estimated that the total cost of bringing our forces back to these shores will be about $1,400 million.
Almost 300,000 Americans never came home. Most of the men who went away to war returned by the millions sooner than most people had expected. Separation centers worked overtime, processing 750,000 men each month. In less than a year, the armed forces returned more than 12 million young men to civilian life. The GI Bill, with its financial and educational benefits, gave millions of veterans a chance to advance into the middle class. A great many seized the opportunity. Most veterans were anxious to put the war behind them. They collected $3 billion in mustering out pay and went looking for civilian jobs. At the employment offices, veterans got preferential treatment. They were the nation's heroes, after all. And there were low-cost home loans for veterans and low-interest loans to help them buy a farm or start a business. And many did just that. 2,230,000 veterans went to college on the GI Bill. For these pragmatic children of the Depression, a college degree was a ticket to the affluent middle class. It had been a costly war, almost 300,000 Americans dead. More than 670,000 were wounded, many of them permanently disabled. On the home front, one last bond drive.
At the Roosevelt home in Hyde Park, the War Activities Committee of the motion picture industry stages a bond rally where Colonel James Devereaux, hero of Wake Island, starts the ball rolling. Merle Oberon, Universal Screen star, registered applications for Roosevelt bonds, and the Victory Loan is off to a flying start.
The reconversion of war plants to peacetime pursuits is going ahead at full speed. And once more, the automobile factories are humming as huge stamping presses form the bodies of the first automobiles produced since the spring of 1942. Prices on these 1946 models will be slightly higher, but with all priorities lifted, America will be on wheels once more.
At the huge Willow Run factory in Michigan, where warplanes were made, the first new cars of the Kaiser Fraser Company are designed and built. The first models are handmade, and are the forerunners of hundreds of thousands which will be turned out under assembly line methods. Mr. Kaiser produced hundreds of Liberty transport ships for the Allied war effort. Now he and Mr. Fraser present their peacetime product. The six-cylinder Kaiser car features front-wheel drive.
It had been a long, long time since Americans had been free to buy anything they wanted, but now the war was over. Cars, radios, cordless electric irons, consumer goods of all kinds were coming off the assembly lines. The Great Depression was just a memory. Most Americans had prospered during the war. They had money now, and they were eager to spend it. Millions of returning veterans got married. That created a demand for new houses and new kitchen appliances. Rationing had ended, food was plentiful. Overnight, it seemed, traditionally frugal Americans became conspicuous consumers. Nylons filled the shop windows, and real rubber tires rolled out of the factories for the new cars coming off the reconverted assembly lines. Americans climbed back into their automobiles. With light hearts and no road maps, they headed off into a materialistic world of the future, never to return. "12 million American men had been away from their families for 2, 3, even 4 years. They had changed. So had the people who had waited for them at home.
Never thought that you would be standing here so close to me. There's so much I feel that I should say, but words can wait until some other day. Kiss me once, then kiss me twice, then kiss me once again. It's been a long, long time. Haven't felt like this, my dear, since can't remember when. It's been a long, long time. You'll never know how many dreams I dream about you, or just how empty they all seem without you. So kiss me once, then kiss me twice, then kiss me once again. It's been a long, long time.
The American invasion of Japan was far different from what had been imagined. Hundreds of American women and children sailed across the Pacific to join the American servicemen who had volunteered to remain overseas. The arrival of these wives and children in Japan showed that something had changed in America. The United States was going to stay for a while, not just to keep a defeated enemy from rising again, but to maintain an American military and naval presence in the Far East.
The American people want to help the German people to win their way back to an honorable place among the free and peace-loving nations of the world.
Defeated Germany was in shambles, divided between East and West. Americans talked about democracy, Germans worried about getting enough to eat. The black market flourished in the ruins. In the American zone of occupation, German schoolrooms were scrubbed clean of Nazi ideology. Americans encouraged the German people to vote in free elections and to begin to take charge of their own affairs. With American help, West Germany began to rebuild its shattered economy. German factories began producing again. In the Russian zone, it was different. The Soviet Union, which had lost about 20 million people during the war, treated the Germans harshly. Machine by machine, whole factories were dismantled and shipped to the Soviet Union. Impoverished East Germany had no choice but to become a subservient communist state. The newsreel pictures of refugees wandering the roads of Europe disturbed Americans whose homes had not been bombed, whose cities had not been destroyed. Europe, Great Britain included, was exhausted physically and economically. Of all the combatant nations in World War II, only the United States had emerged strong and prosperous. American isolationists had, in one sense, been right. Once involved in the affairs of Europe, Americans would find it difficult, if not impossible, to withdraw. What kept the United States in Europe was not just human compassion and generosity, but that played a part. The Soviet Union now dominated Eastern Europe, and the Cold War had begun. In the final days of World War II, Allied troops liberated the survivors of the Nazi extermination camps. Whatever doubts Americans might have had about the war and about the righteousness of their cause were now removed. The enormity of Hitler's crime against humanity was almost incomprehensible. Here, for all to see at last, was a doctrine of racial superiority carried to its inevitable extreme, genocide. The story and the memory of the Holocaust would grow in the American consciousness for years to come. But in post-war America, there was no rush to stamp out racial prejudice and injustice. What happened in the years that followed World War II is, of course, another story. Across the world, the seeds of the Cold War, of Korea, of Vietnam, had already been planted. America, once so complacent and self-contained, would never be the same again. Americans never found a way back to what they believed existed before the war.
There's a star-spangled banner waving somewhere. That is where I want to live when I die.
The war years brought a tremendous shift in population. 15 million Americans had packed up their music and their accents and their attitudes and moved from the country to the city, from the south to the north, from the east to the west. By the millions, they left their farms and small towns to find work, and many stayed where they found it. The war brought big government to America. Never before had Washington employed so many people or exercised so much direct control over the personal lives of individual American citizens. Rationing ended when the war ended. Wage and price controls were lifted, but not the income tax. The War Department changed its name and continued to spend the taxpayers' money for defense. Big business got bigger during the war. With increased capital, production capacity, and new technology, American industry was in a position to dominate the post-war domestic and world markets. America owned 50% of the world's material assets for a time. Bigness changed America's small towns. The neighborhood grocer gave way to the new, impersonal, cost-efficient supermarket. Before the war, 23% of the American people lived on farms. 50 years later, just 2%. Many American farm families were replaced by corporations. Something called the agribusiness took hold.
This job belongs to some soldier. And when he comes back, he can have it.
Many American women were forced to retreat to the kitchen when the war ended. They had done men's work in industry during the war. They had managed their own lives while their men were away. For some, the return to the pre-war role of housewife and mother was difficult. Some women continued to work after the war because they wanted to or because they had to, but not on an equal footing with men. It would take a long time for American women to overcome male prejudice in the workplace, to move from the lunchroom to the boardroom. Traditional standards of behavior and morality were challenged and ignored during the excitement and disruption of the war. Too many young Americans had gone too far away from home, into the service or to the wartime boom towns. Loose behavior was tolerated, even justified. Many hasty wartime marriages fell apart. For the first time in America, divorce became commonplace. Traditional courting patterns changed. American parents had less to say about whom their children married. Marry they did, thanks to the GI Bill, by the millions. In just 50 years, the population of the United States doubled. Most black Americans emerged from the war not much better off than they had been before Pearl Harbor. Some black servicemen, those who were given the chance, distinguished themselves in combat. But the armed forces were not desegregated until 1948. Eventually, a black general would become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but not until 40 years later. White Americans seemed determined to maintain a segregated society by law or by custom. But black Americans had learned that change was possible and perhaps inevitable. A nation that had crusaded against Hitler's racist ideology could not, in good conscience, forever deny full civil rights to any of its citizens. Today, many Americans look back on the war years with a real longing for the way things used to be. But memory plays tricks on us all. Do the pictures taken then show us America as it really was, or as Americans wished it to be? No matter, real or imagined, it is gone. The post-war years found unscathed America virtually in charge of the world because all other societies were weak and wounded. This time, the United States did not crawl back into its isolated fortress. At the start of the war, America had been the world's hope. Now it was the world's necessity. The destruction had been immeasurable. The cost to America, those young lives, of course, not one of them replaceable. But somehow pain and sorrow do not communicate, not very far, not very long. So 1,000 deaths leave an empty space at only one family table. That is why I suppose nations survive wars and carry on, to fight more wars should history so decree. I'm Eric Severide.
There's nothing left for me of days that used to be. I live in memory among my souvenirs. Some letters typed with blue, a photograph or two. I see a rose from you among my souvenirs. A few more tokens rest within my treasure chest, And though they do their best to give me consolation, I count them all apart. And as the teardrops start, I find a broken heart among my souvenirs.